Now, Boker Tov, we can get started, or it's a rhyme Tovim in Israel, anybody in Israel, on Pirkei Avot itself. Okay, so last week we were discussing the tension between issuing judgment. The Mishnah says don't be a judge. It's a really bad thing. Being a judge, your people are gonna hate you, and it's in thievery and mistakes and all kinds of things. And on the other hand, Dina Met Lamito, one who judges a true judgment, it becomes a partner with God. That's the most important part of the Torah, to put Torah into practice. What did Yitro tell Moshe before Matan Torah? The first thing we have, the parsha before Matan Torah, is to set up a court system that have judges. That's the most important part. So we discussed that was our discussion a little bit last week, and we said the importance of pshara, of compromise, perhaps, and perhaps they're both true. In other words, somebody has to do it, but it's a tough job. People are not going to like you if you're a judge. And we said, thank God, in democracies it's a little bit better, but we know judicial systems are under attack in many parts of the world, including in democracies. I don't have to speak any further, and that's very important to it. But some commentators want to explain, if he makes a mistake, that's what it means. He doesn't work so hard. So what I want to do, I mentioned last week, I just want to spend a few minutes, and actually going to, hopefully I'll share my screen. I want to discuss, spend a few minutes, we'll see how long it takes, on the introduction of Rav Moshe Feinstein to Zigra Moshe. If I can just have a show of hands or in the chat box, if anybody has read the introduction of the Igros Moshe. You can let me know if yes or no. I assume most people have not, but if anybody has, I'm just be curious. Okay, so Rav Moshe Feinstein, as I'm sure most people here have heard of him, he born in 1895 in Russia, and he came to America, I believe, in 1937, if I'm not mistaken. In other words, he got here before the war. I lived on the Lower East Side, I believe 444 FDR Drive, I believe. He has all his truths. Rav Moshe was extremely accessible. You could call him on the phone. One of my favorite tshuvot in Rav Moshe, it's such a beautiful response, and the sensitivity and shows, and the culture of the time. A woman called him who lived in his same apartment building one Friday, or I don't know if she called, I assume she didn't call on the Friday, she called probably on the Sunday, said, Rabbi Feinstein, I don't understand. I looked on the calendar and it said that candle lighting is at the 4:19. And I noticed that you got picked up to go to shul. Somebody took you in the car at 4:21. I don't understand, Rabbi. How can you get in a car after the time of Shabbat? So it's a beautiful question. You know, the people, not Nosbud says in the calendar, candle lighting is at 4:18. So Shabbat starts at 4:18. But anybody who has a little bit of knowledge knows there's sort of an 18-minute window. At least in America, we do an 18-minute window. In Jerusalem, we do a 40-minute window. In England, we do a 13-minute window, I believe. Why it's 13:18, that I can explain halachically. Why the Jerusalem custom, I don't know exactly. Well, whatever it is, we all know that. Because, and how many people always, I'm sure most, I don't know, well, most people, many people don't like candles exactly on time. Especially you make an early Shabbos in the summer, okay. But in the winter, good, I got 18 minutes. So Rav Moshe explained that, it's really allowed, blah, blah, he gave the halachic explanation, but then he said, you know what, it really doesn't look good. People are going to see. He says, so I'm going to take it upon myself. I'm never going to get in a car anymore after the time it says on the calendar. It's such to me, a beautiful sensitivity to, someone, and also being aware. He probably, maybe there's even a halachic concern, Maridain a little bit, but that's just one. I mean, there's so many tshuvot. As we discussed last week, Lefi HaMakom, Lefi HaZman, he's somebody who really understood the time and the place, and he wasn't, I don't know how to phrase this, and not that it's even important, but just he wasn't modern Orthodox, he wasn't a Zionist, he wasn't a religious Zionist like Rav Soloveitchik. He wasn't. He was very much in the. I mean, it was different. He was very moderate and but he wasn't. He didn't really believe in going to university. My understanding is one of his grandchildren, one of Rabbi Tendler, who was his son-in-law, who was very modern Orthodox. That itself is interesting. His son-in-law, very much in the modern Orthodox world, Rabbi Tendler, and his son didn't want to go to college. This is what I heard the story once. I don't know, I can't verify it. And he was learning. He was learning with his grandfather, and Rabbi Tendler wanted him to go to university. He felt it's very important that in the modern world, Jews have to get a college education, university education. So they decided to ask Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe said, listen, for him, if it was his son, he would tell him not to go to university. But if your father wants you to go, out of kibbud aim, you should go. Now, we all know that to violate halakha, you don't do kibbud aim. In other words, if your father says to violate the laws of Shabbat, or these, we don't listen. But obviously, he didn't think, he felt that it's also what there's a certain understanding and an awareness of who we are and where you're living and who the people are. So for you, it's, if that's what your father wants, then you should do it. Anyways, so Rav Moshe really put Torah, halachic Torah on the map in Judaism. Was the great posek, and he lived to be in his 90s, passed away in 1986 on Tiny Esther, they had the funeral on Tiny Esther in the Lower East Side, and but then he was buried in Israel. Okay, that's by way of introduction. And he dealt with all the modern questions, all the medical ethical issues, a lot of technology issues. I remember as a microwave ovens when they first got into electricity, hearing aids, you name it. He dealt, I mean, we're talking now, he flourished after World War II as he became famous. I mean, I think he was known even before, but I believe his first tshuva, the first set of Igur Moshe, were published in the 50s. So he became, and he dealt with all the crucial issues. And the old joke was when somebody got smicha, they gave you a klaf, a certificate, and Rav Moshe Feinstein's phone number. If you have any problem, you call him up, because I could say he was extremely accessible. It's not true about everybody anymore. Anyways, with that introduction, I'm talking about the importance of what a posek is and judging. I'd like to spend a few minutes going over his introduction with you. Can everybody see it? Can somebody say yes if they can see it? Uh-oh. Yes?
Yes, it's right.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
White enough? Good. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so and you can see the parts in yellow?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Hakdama, the introduction to Rav Moshe. I don't have it in English translation, I'm sorry, but I'll obviously translate everything. And we're not going to read the whole thing. I'll read much of the yellow parts, but Hinesi phrase Sherubohu Masha Chashapti, Shahishapti Masha Yenerel Anyuta Tila Rad Halachala Elu Sheratzule Dati. He writes like this. This book is what I answer to people, what I think, according to the meekness of my intelligent knowledge, halacha l'maseh, in practice. This is not theoretical. Sometimes rabbis write responses that it's very nice in theory, but I don't want you to act on it on practice. Rav Moshe was fearless. Rav Moshe was absolutely fearless, and that's all great poskim. That's what makes you a great posek, is you're fearless and you're willing to state controversial positions, and you're willing to listen to other opinions and perhaps to change your mind. Great people change their mind. But if you think you're right, you're not going to give in to pressure. Perhaps the most famous and saddest example is his tshuva on artificial insemination, where Rav Moshe, one of his more famous responses was to allow artificial insemination. I don't think it's common today. They have other methods. I don't think it's as common, but to use it with a donor sperm can be placed in a man's wife. It's so the kid is born. The kid is not. It's not the father. The husband of the mother is not the father of the child. That we all agree. And Rav Moshe allowed that, and many people didn't like that. Let's put it mildly. And the things they did to Rav Moshe are terrible. And Rav Moshe never backed down. He would not back down. He would write. I think I mentioned the story once. Very tragic story. I can stop sharing for a minute. Very tragic story. I mentioned, I think last year, about what was his name? Galat, I think, the person who was killed in the Hebron terrorist attack in 1980 on a Bnei Akiva Shevet Kisufim Shabbaton. I'm in Shevet Golan, for those who are Bnei Akivaniks. So that was the year ahead of me. Like they was the people a year older than me. I was in Israel when this happened. And I believe in 1980, right before Lag BaOmer. So they had a Bnei Akiva Shabbaton. They had opened up Beit Hadassah in Hebron. There's a terrorist attack. 6 people were killed, including 2 Americans. So this one of them was killed. I think his name was Glatt. He lived in New York, and he was learning in Merkaz Harav. And he was a budding Talmud Chacham, and he had already written. He was like 20 years old. He had written a whole bunch of articles and manuscripts, manuscripts, he'd written stuff. So after he passed away, after he was killed, they published a little book. I have it there in the back, Meyapar Kumi. And it was a book of his writing. So half of it is philosophical issues, hashkafa, what we would call, and half of it is halakha. And he famously, he takes on Rav Moshe Feinstein. He's a 20-year-old kid. And Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva that there's no obligation to live in Israel. It's a nice thing to do. It's a mitzvah. Like he compares it like tzitzis. You don't have to wear tzitzis. If you wear a 4-corner garment, so you have to put on tzitzis. You don't have to wear a 4-corner garment. It's So of course everybody who does, but you don't have to. And so he says it's very nice to live in Israel, but there's no obligation, because that was one of Rav Moshe's things. If I don't know how much. I don't know that he wrote about it here, but he wrote about it on his smoking tshuva, that if lots of religious people are doing something, it has to be right. So many religious people don't live in Israel. Otherwise, religious people don't. I know, maybe I'm not religious. I don't know. It's who decides, but I try to be. But many people who try to observe the Torah, they keep kosher and Shabbos and learn every day and put on tefillin or whatever. And all the mitzvot, they're try not to talk lashon hara and be honest in business, and they don't live in Israel. How could that be? So Rav Moshe says it's a mitzvah kiyumi. You fulfill a mitzvah, but you don't. It's not a chiyuvit. It's not like eating matzah. You must eat matzah. You must sit in the sukkah. You must put a mezuzah on. No, actually, that's only if you have a house. That's true. You don't have to put a mezuzah on. Only if you have a house. Okay, you don't have to have a house. This young boy, Shem Yikom Damo, he wrote a whole response why Rav Moshe is wrong, and he wrote 15 pages, bringing all the sources that you are obligated to live in Israel, and those Jews like me who don't live in Israel are sinning. So maybe occasionally there's an excuse. The Gemara talks about keep it up. Hey, whatever. There may be reasons. There may be exceptional cases. I mentioned Rav Avram Shapiro, the chief rabbi of Israel, told Rav Shachter it's forbidden for him to make aliyah. He was the chief rabbi of Israel. He said, you have too much of an influence in America. You won't have that influence in Israel, which is often true. Often rabbis move to Israel. They don't have that influence, but told him it's forbidden. Rav Shachter wrote why he disagrees with him, that it's not forbidden for him to make aliyah, but he hasn't made aliyah yet. Anyways, so he wrote a disagreement, and then they sent the book to Rav Moshe Feinstein to give a haskama. That's what the common style. You send it to a great rabbi to write a nice thing at the beginning. And Rav Moshe had a policy. Rav Moshe Feinstein never gave haskamot, first of all, on halakhic works, because he would write, I don't have time to read the whole book, but everybody sent him a book he's going to read. It's not every book is worthy of of being read by, especially by the elite of the elite. So he said, I would, if I give a haskama, it means I agree with everything in the book, and it may be wonderful, but I can't, I'm probably going to disagree with things. So he would write, you're a nice person, I give you blessing, God should bless you, and your children should be learning Torah. And, he says some very nice things, and he'll often write, that's why Art Scroll never translates the haskamot, because for people brought up in Western society, it doesn't work. Like you read the back of a cover when a professor at Harvard writes something, he writes on the book. But Rav Moshe would write, I didn't have time to read the book. My English is not that great. If it was a book in English, I'm not so fluent in English. I didn't have time to read the book. I don't know the person who wrote it, but I'm sure they tell me he's a Ben Torah, he's a nice person. So I give him a blessing. He should, merit to Torah. So it's not something you want to translate this, a great approbation of a book. But on this particular book, Rav Moshe wrote a whole piece, and he said that, I read the entire chapter. He wrote how terrible, but I read the entire chapter, and I appreciated. That's a great, everybody's free to argue, as we'll see. But I still think I'm correct, and then explain why I'm correct, and I can answer his arguments. It's a real haskama. But anyways, that's you'll see Ramosha is writing to people who want to accept his views, let's go back here. Let me share my screen. Hopefully it, okay. Anyways, so he says like this, really, I should not issue rulings. Who am I? Great people, as we discussed, where the same way you don't want to be a judge. Issuing a ruling is kind of like being a judge. So he says like this. So he explains you shouldn't do it, but he says you have no choice. Says here in the second part. Says like this. Only people who are worthy, oh, I just lost the yellow. Okay, only people who are worthy are allowed to issue a ruling. But he said being worthy is not an objective standard, it's a subjective standard. It's a very interesting point. That, in other words, we can't say, well, who are we? Look at the Rambam, look at these people. It doesn't matter because Yiftach Kedoro, Kishmuel Bedoro, it really doesn't matter. Every generation has a difference. Who's ever the best in that generation. So then he says, Im Kain, the last paragraph, Kosha Kain Lektani Eric Kamoni, Shane B. Torek, Vachakma Karisha Elim. It says, I really shouldn't be issuing. I don't know anything. Okay, I don't know false humility or whatever. I mean, not but I'm sure what he believed. But Kosha Kain, this is very interesting. It's one thing for me to issue a ruling. It's another thing to print it. Because once something is printed, that gives it permanence and great status. The written word, that's, oral law, who cares, but it's the written law that counts. So he says he shouldn't do that. So he explains why is he writing his tshuva then? So he says like this, he develops this concept here in the third line in the second paragraph. He says like this, second line, he says, but dailachush, we have to be afraid. A halakhic decider has to be nervous that he will not issue a completely true ruling. He can make mistakes. It's very hard. As it is the truth. Klape Shemaya, as it's the truth. You see, it's getting unread as I go. In heaven, there's the truth in heaven. Aval amet lahora'ah, kvar nemar lo b'shemaim hi. But truth for a ruling in halakha, it doesn't matter in heaven. We say lo b'shemaim hi. The Torah is not in heaven. In other words, Ramosha develops this really sort of a very fascinating theme that there are two truths. Now, we like to think there's one truth. We'll get back to that, right? There's the truth, the real truth in heaven, what God wants. God followed the view of Rabbi Eliezer in that famous story when he said, if I'm right, let a heavenly voice come, all the tricks that he did. So he says there's truth in heaven, but truth in heaven doesn't matter. What matters is truth on earth, or what he calls emet lahora'ah, the truth for issuing a ruling, and that's lo b'shemaim hi. So even if you're wrong, it doesn't matter. And one is obligated to rule according to what he sees on earth, even though it's known in heaven that it's not correct. And that's what the rabbis mean, divrei Elohim chaim, elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim. These and those are the words of living God, even though you're wrong. You will receive a reward for your ruling, even though the truth is not like you. Now, okay, one could argue on this, but hopefully I'll come back at the end. And he brings a proof for this. He says there's a debate in halakha. We all know you can do a brit milah on Shabbat. You can do a brit milah on Shabbat. That's because it says ubayom hashmini imo basar latod. I mean, the Torah says on the 8th day, and the rabbis say, why does the Torah stress ubayom hashmini? The 8th day, even on Shabbat, you can do a brit milah. But let's say the mohel forgot to bring the knife, or he doesn't have a knife to do the brit milah. So that's a debate in halakha. So the accepted halachic opinion is you're stuck. You can't do the brit milah. That's it. You'll do it on Sunday. Rabbi Eliezer, there's a whole chapter, the 19th chapter in Masechet Shabbos, Rabbi Eliezer de Milah. It's called Rabbi Eliezer of the bris of Milah. And Rabbi Eliezer disagreed. He had this idea, machshirei milah. Anything that's needed to prepare for the brit milah is also allowed to be done on Shabbat. He went so far as you can cut down a tree. and make chisel, I don't know, make a fire, to take metal, to burn the metal, you can spend like 5 hours preparing a knife from scratch on Shabbat in order to do the Brit Milah. That was his opinion. And that opinion was rejected, and we're not allowed to do that. We don't follow that. And nonetheless, the Gemara says that his city, when there was a decree against Brit Milah, the Romans put a decree, it didn't apply to his city. They were given great rewards. In other words, even though they were wrong, they were right. Kind of like we used to say as kids. I remember when I was, the umpire is wrong even if he's right. He's right even if he's wrong. In other words, the halakha can't, no human system can be perfect. It doesn't matter if it's wrong. As long as the person does the best that he can do, and that's very important. That's what he writes. The truth in issuing a ruling here, you're obligated to rule, and you also receive reward. What he feels. He has to spend all his efforts. And this is something that I mentioned people don't like. They call the rabbi on the phone and they expect an answer on the phone, or even worse, they put a post on the internet. We've spoken about that. Don't like that at all. I think it's really a bad thing. You can't, because as you're already learning, there's no absolute truth. When it comes to Hora'ah, Ramosha not developing this theme, but we've talked about it. There's sociological factors, depends how wealthy you are. That's in the Ramah, how much money is going to, I know that sounds a little bit funny, but that's an important, the economy is an important consideration in Psak Halacha. And there are all kinds of factors that a computer can't know, and a rabbi who doesn't know you can't know. That's why we always had Maradacha. We've lost that. We've spoken about that before. That's unfortunate. I believe, but a rabbi has to work really, really hard to know the halacha and then know how to apply it. So that's apshe ha'emet mamash no kain. Even though the truth is not really like that. We have no way of knowing. But Moshe says it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. We have two types of truth. We have absolute truth in heaven, and we have the emet lahora'ah, the truth in down on earth. Okay, so that's let me go to page 2 because it's the way my computer worked. Let me share here. Okay. No, I went to the wrong one, of course. Sorry, let me try this. Here we go. You know what? I don't know what's going on here. Let me give me 1 second. Intro to, okay, if not, I'll just do a Torah Shabbat pad like I generally do. Okay, I don't know where it is. Okay, so I'll just continue. It's all right. I could, maybe if I spent 5 minutes, I could find it, but let's not do that. You got part of it, but then Ramosha writes a couple of, he says a beautiful idea. He says, so when people ask him questions, he had to answer. He says that a posek, someone who is, halachic authority, is obligated to personally answer the questions. He's not allowed to dump the questions onto somebody else. If somebody comes to you to ask a question, none of that say, well, go ask Rav Moshe Feinstein. Well, what are you asking me for? I'm just your local young Israel rabbi. Well, don't go ask, Rav Schachter, go ask whoever, go ask the Rosh Hashiva in Lakewood. So Rav Moshe says you're not allowed to do that. Now, of course, Rav Moshe is assuming the person you're asking the question to is qualified, can answer. But if he's, and qualified doesn't mean he's Rav Moshe Feinstein. Qualified, and lots of people are qualified. You have to know what your limits are. You want to say something? You want to ask a question?
Right.
I'm sorry. Oops. I think I muted you by mistake. Judith, you want to ask a question? Go ahead. No. Okay, whatever. Okay, you can unmute yourself. Sorry about that. So Rav Moshe says you're not allowed, the posek has a personal obligation to answer questions that are asked to him. There's a reason somebody comes to you for a question. Now, just like when you go to a doctor and he's not a specialist in the field, you go to your GP, he consults with people. So rabbis consult with people, but your job is to consult with the experts, to analyze the situation, to know the person to get back to. That's Rav Moshe makes that very clear. Okay, you won't see it in print. Maybe I'll try to find it afterwards. But so that's one thing he points out. And then he also, now, by the way, this is sometimes not done. In other words, it's well known. Avram Steinberg, Rabbi Dr. Avram Steinberg, the world's leading expert in medical halacha. Those have been to our medical ethics conference coming up on July 11th online. Anyway, so he mentioned more than once that Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who was really one of the great, he was like the Rav Moshe Feinstein of Israel. And he was also totally conversant. I mean, he would call over the top professor of physics at Hebrew University and spend like, a week with him, or, whatever, a day with him. And he would tell him, what book should I read so I know how physics works, so I can issue rulings on electricity on Shabbat. Rav Shlomo Zalman was very famous for that. He was brilliant. And even though he didn't go to university, I'm sure he could be a professor in university in some of the fields. Anyways, so it's well known that Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, someone would come to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach to do an abortion. Let's say a famous case, Tay-Sachs trial, that used to be more common. And Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach felt it wasn't allowed. Moshe felt it wasn't allowed. They felt it wasn't allowed. But sometimes you can tell the person's looking for a heter. So Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said, I'm not sure. Why don't you go ask Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer? He was the official posek Tzedek Hospital. And he said, why don't you
building that my fancy eye doctor was on 64th is an MSK.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Building with a doorman, like a doorman.
Okay. Anyway, so Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach would say, go to Rabbi Waldenberg, because he knew this woman really wanted an abortion. She couldn't handle it. He didn't think it was right. But he knew Rabbi Waldenberg felt it was right. It was allowed. So he would send it to Rabbi Waldenberg. But that's a special situation. It's also a great posek. Great posek knows when we can rely on opinions that I don't agree with. And Rav Moshe finishes. I wanted to show you inside. It's really beautiful. Rav Moshe says, everybody read what I write. If you agree with me, great. If you don't agree with me, that's also great. You don't have to accept anything I write. It's only, as we saw in the beginning, people who ask me what I think. So I tell them what I think. If you're not asking me, you don't have to follow me. And even if you are asking me, I'm going to write. He says, I'm going to explain all my reasonings, because if I explain my reasons, you can then disagree. If you disagree with my reasoning, so you'll disagree with my final conclusion. And that's great. That's a wonderful thing. I mentioned before, I believe, the tshuva of Rav Moshe about the person moving to Bnei Brak. He didn't want to move to Bnei Brak because he was going to disagree with the Chazon Ish, and he felt that's not so respectful. And Rav Moshe, what are you talking about? That's the most respectful thing in the world. Great rabbis love it when people argue with them. I say that all the time. If who wants to, if you say something, everybody nods their head. That doesn't mean anything when they engage with you. So Rav Moshe writes at the end that accept it, read it. If you don't like it, that's fine. And then he adds a very cute thing. He just says at the end, I also write in this book to give pleasure to my father, to give nachas to my father, Hagan Rav David Feinstein. And he says, my father told me, it's interesting that he would write this. My father told me when I was young that one day the Jewish people are going to come to you to ask all their questions, and see, that's also, it's like, he understood his greatness. On the one hand, who am I to answer questions? On the other hand, he kind of, he said, my father gave me a blessing. Everybody will come to answer. So I write these tshuvot, and, hopefully my father, I don't think his father was not alive then. His father could have much nachat ruach. Okay, so I just want to pick up on one thing that I alluded to. Rav Moshe says that if there's truth in heaven and there's truth in earth. There's truth in heaven and truth in earth, and it could be the truth in earth is wrong. but it doesn't matter. Torah lo b'shmaim. Now, I don't know, this might be troubling to people, might not be. In other words, that it could be our whole interpretation of Torah of many things is incorrect. I think you can argue on Rav Moshe. I think you could say the truth in heaven is what's determined on earth. In other words, or to put it slightly differently, the Torah is gray. The Torah is very gray. Don't murder isn't gray, but even there, when wartime, etc., it's not so clear. Much of the Torah is gray. So two people can look at the same facts and have different opinions. Please God, if this government in Israel works, please God, and have unity, Baruch Hashem, that's something we severely need. I think one of the beautiful things will be that, we can have sharp disagreements and work together. Unfortunately, the toxic tone, I'm not even talking political views, what you think, and maybe people will get upset at me for saying this, but I'm talking on a moral plane. The toxicity and the putting down of the this and the that, they're the enemies of Israel. Two people, somebody can be in favor of a Palestinian state and withdraw from the settlements, not and be somebody who loves Israel and cares deeply about Israel. It's not somebody who wants to, they have different views. It's not so clear. Clearly, it's not so working. We have a war every few years in Gaza. That's not working so well. So, one doesn't know. I admit, I don't know. But I'm saying the idea that we can have the right and the left and religious and Arabs and Jews work together, that would be a beautiful, beautiful thing. Please God. So that's so you can have Elu ve'elu divrei chaim. Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, that's what the Gemara says. They loved each other and they married each other and they got along. They argued vehemently with each other, right? They're the famous case where they argue. It's a little bit of a complicated case, but it basically has to do with who you can marry. If Yibum, if a man dies without any children, so the brother has to marry the wife. Let's say the man is married to two women, right? In biblical times, you were allowed to marry two women. And one of the women, one of the wives is the sister of his wife. So he can't marry the sister, obviously. You have to yibum to one of the two wives. You don't have to yibum to both. You do yibum or chalitza to one of the two. So no, he can't do to his sister-in-law because he's married to one sister. Reuven and Shimon married Rachel and Leah. And then Rachel and Shimon's married to Yakut, I don't know, to whatever, to Miriam also. So he could marry Miriam, but since he can't marry Leah, because Leah is his Rachel's sister, he can't marry two sisters, he's not allowed to marry, he can't do Yibum to Miriam either. That's how we rule. That's Beit Shammai's opinion. In other words, the tzara, the co-wife of the relative, is exempt from Yibum and Chalitza. That's Beit Hillel's opinion. And Beit Shammai's opinion is no, he can't marry the sister, but he can marry, not only can he's obligated to. He's either obligated to Yibum or Chalitza. So it turns out, according to Beit Shammai, you marry this woman. According to Beit Hillel, the Charles and Mamzer. And according to Beit Shammai, you fulfilled a great mitzvah. Now that's pretty sharp argument. That's not an argument whether the tuna fish is kosher or the pizza stop. This is or electricity is allowed on Shabbos. Not even like that. This is like a mamzer, you can't get more serious than that. And the Gemara says, nonetheless, okay, so they felt that, but they married each other. What happens when somebody like this? They would let each other know, according to your, this particular person, they better marry a Beit Shammai family, not a Beit Hillel family. I don't know, that sounds a little strange to us, but the Gemara says they loved each other, they worked for each other. You can disagree and get along. So I don't know, when Rav Moshe says, Rav Moshe's understanding of Elu ve'elu is that even if you're wrong, in other words, there is one truth. Nonetheless, since we tried the best we can, and we did the best we can on earth, this is also true. It's not really true, but it's true in practice. And we consider it Divrei Elohim Chaim, even though it's not. And I think there are others who have another approach. No, the Torah is gray. Can you marry this woman? Depends. There are arguments yes, there are arguments no. What's the truth? God left it up to every generation. God partnered with us. When God created an incomplete world, Keep Shua, the first mitzvah, have children and conquer the world. That means how is the world going to conquer? Well, it's up to us. And as long as we do something positive, that's great. So too, God created in many ways an incomplete Torah. I mean, that's clear. God left it for the Torah. And we have it in the Gemara, there for every generation, there has to be something left for them to do. Like Torah can never be finished, right? The Gemara always have that expression. Makom, they left me a place so I can add my own insight. So it could be the Torah, God sort of wrote something parv. What's the truth? There is no truth in heaven. It could be two truths. How's it going to turn out, right? You write a play. How's the play going to end? Two endings are possible. Which one is true? Whichever one you write is true. So it could be elu ve'elu, two things that are wrong can both be true. Now that raises another problem. How can two things be true that are the opposite? How can I marry this woman, and how can I not marry this woman? Or take a much more simple example. How can I say Bori Pri Hagafen at the beginning of Kiddush, what we do? I mean, Yom HaShishi sort of doesn't really count. That's the intro to Kiddush. But the Kiddush itself starts at Bori Pri Hagafen. So do you say that at the beginning, which of course we all do, Beit Hillel, and Beit Shammai says, no, you say it at the end. First you talk on Shabbat. So that's also okay, and that's not such a big deal. So how can they both be right? So that could be, maybe. So I don't know. This is what I was explaining last week. Ha'emet v'shalom ahavo. That there's a contradiction between truth and peace. And we said in the Yemot HaMashiach, when the fast of the 4th, the 5th, the 7th, and the 10th, when the fast days will be days of holidays, Zechariah says those days will be you l'sason u'l'simcha, days of rejoicing, ha'emet v'shalom ahavo. You should love truth and peace. So, and I said, Rav Soloveitchik quoted his father saying, only in Yemot HaMashiach can truth and peace coexist, because they're opposites. Truth and peace opposite. I mean, sometimes, but obviously, truth, if you want to totally insist, that Israel has the right to every inch of land, whatever argument you have, that may or may not, but whatever, may be the truth, but it's not going to bring peace. And if you want too much peace, so you have to compromise. Sometimes Peter said, but in Yemot HaMashiach, we don't understand that peace and truth can coexist. So maybe this idea of elu be'elu is this idea. But anyways, that's just perhaps a theoretical halakha, how does the system work. But I just felt I want the introduction of Rav Moshe, the modesty on the one hand, but the assertiveness that it's true, maybe in theory, who am I to issue rulings, but that's not how the system works. You have to issue rulings, somebody, and whoever the best in every generation, and you have to know yourself, right? We sometimes underestimate who we are, right? Sometimes there's, false humility, which the person has to know and has to be willing to stand up to their positions. Okay, I'll just add one other thing. I haven't seen this inside, but I remember Rav Schechter told us that Rav Chaim of Volozhin was, of course, the founder of the yeshiva of Volozhin. That's why he's called Rav Chaim of Volozhin. I don't know what his real last name was, actually. I assume he had one. He died in 1821, founded the yeshiva in 1803. The Vilna Gaon dies in 1797. And most of his students go to Israel. He encourages them all to make aliyah, and he tells Rav Chaim to stay behind and start the yeshiva. And the Volozhin yeshiva becomes the mother of all yeshivot. So then his son-in-law Rav becomes the Rosh Yeshiva. So there's a book. I think there was a fire. I think a lot of Rav Chaim's writings were lost in a fire. They didn't have like copies back then, but they have this word, Chud HaMeshulash, the 3 early Rosh Yeshivas of the Volozhin Yeshiva. So in there, apparently he has a comment that the verse we're going to read in the beginning of Dvarim, Lo tagur mifnei ish, that the first thing that Moshe Rabbeinu tells us in Sefer Dvarim, Rabbi Leibtai's class now, we just started on Sefer Dvarim. He didn't address this part last week, really. But the opening verses are about justice, right? If you remember that those are the opening verses, and then he gets into Chet HaMeraglim. But the opening verses are on judgment, what a dying is. So that's the first thing. You're going to the land of Israel, justice. Tzedek, tzedek tirdov. I mean, that verse is later. But the idea of justice and righteousness. So we have one of the laws about a judge is lo tagur mifnei ish. You're not allowed to be afraid of anybody. The judge has to, if he's intimidated, then they're going to falsify the entire system. So apparently he said, Lo tagur mifnei ish includes Rav Yosef Karo. It includes Rav Yosef Karo. And in other words, a great posek is not allowed to be, you're not allowed to be afraid of the Rambam just because the Rambam said something. So Itkowitz, thank you very much. Okay. His name was Itkowitz. Okay. I'm not going to disagree with the Rambam or the Shulchan Aruch, but absolutely you can. One is allowed to disagree with the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch. As a matter of fact, the Mishnah Berurah does that all the time. He's just very, 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 very righteous and had a long beard and a tzaddik, so we don't notice it. But anybody who learns the Mishnah Berurah, notice the Shulchan Aruch says, hey, and the Mishnah Berurah starts quoting, well, the Eliyahu Rabbah says this, and this one says that. And usually he changes it to be more strict, but suddenly we're lenient. Of course, you wouldn't need all the commentaries if people weren't disagreeing and changing things all the time. It's just how it's couched. And Ramosh also, so this is the Lithuanian Torah tradition. I think all traditions in many ways, that halakha kibatrai, that the halakha follows the later day authorities, not the earlier day authorities, because even if the later day authorities are of lesser knowledge, we assume we've seen everything else. The famous example, like a midget on the shoulders of giants, discuss that. So we see further. So and the great poskim were not afraid. Today, I think there's much greater fear of that, somehow not disagreeing, and that it's connected to reform, and it's connected to modernity, it's connected to all kinds of reasons why. It's connected to the fact that halakha is no longer issued by the local rabbi, it's written by generally Rosh Yeshivas who are not really in touch. There's been a lot written about that. We've spoken about that. That's not the traditional way of psak. All the great rabbis that you know of, the Noda Yehuda and the Khatam Sofer, they're all rabbis. Like, they didn't make speeches at bar mitzvahs and weddings probably the same way the modern rabbi does, and they didn't have to fundraise necessarily, but they were rabbis of communities. They dealt with people. They weren't in the yeshiva. And for all kinds of reasons, the halakhic system has changed. In other words, the authority and who issues halakhic ruling, but the classical ruling of halakha and then was that the local rabbi, and if he didn't know, he consulted with somebody else. But as Rav Moshe says, the local rabbi gives the answer. He's the one who, after consulting, he decides what to do because he knows the people involved. And that's how the halakhic system is meant to work. And yes, if we're going to disagree with our predecessors, if we bring proofs, and that's what the Ramah writes. We ended last week. He said, what happens if the judge makes a mistake? Whatever he makes a mistake and it costs somebody a lot of money. So what should we do? Anybody? What do you do if so there's a whole siman in Shulchan Aruch, without getting into all the details. Basically, it depends on two factors. It depends how expert the rabbi is, and it depends if he was accepted by the litigants. And basically, a person who is what we call a mumcha, a person who's an expert, he is allowed if he makes a mistake, generally it's too bad. If you can undo the case. In other words, if everybody's there, you do a retrial. But the guy took the money and he moved out of town and you have no way to track him down. And it mistakes. And it turns out I cost Ruvain $1,000 that went to Shimon by mistake. So if it's an honest mistake, even though it's a mistake, and he was an expert, so he's exempt. The judge is exempt from paying. If he's some guy who's not so expert, he shouldn't have been issuing rulings. He's just, then he would have to pay. So it's very interesting. Basically, what I know Americans are so used to, your doctor makes a mistake, lawyer, they sue everybody, they sue experts. And the halacha wanted to get away from that because we're human beings and all human beings make mistakes. And therefore, if you're an expert and you tried your best, it's sad. And if we can redo the case, of course we will. But if we can't, that's life. That's life, and you lose. Because otherwise it would be an intolerable system. Like, I don't know, do people go into obstetrics anymore? They're afraid of lawsuits. I remember when 20 years ago, people tell me there were fields in medicine people didn't want to go into because the insurance was $150,000 a year to get insurance. It was impossible. So the halakha tried to avoid that. But and then the Ramah discusses what's considered a mistake. What if you rule according to, it's not in the Gemara, it's not a mistake, just the practice was X and you ruled Y. So the Ramah says, you're not supposed to do that. But if you're allowed to. If you have a proof, you can disagree. What's in the Gemara you can't disagree with. But anything post-Talmudic, That was always the rule. The line is the Talmud. We'll have to discuss another time why. But if it's post-Talmudic, you're allowed to disagree with that idea. Okay, let's discuss a little bit here, Pirkei, but we did a lot here on sort of on the side on ruling. So let's get back into the Mishnah itself, where on Mishnah Chet, just to continue about really just this kind of summarize what we said. Chapter 4, Mishnah Chet, Hu haya omer, Rabbi Yishmael said, Al tihi dan yechidi. Nobody should judge alone. Shein dan yechidi el echad, because there's only one who judges alone. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It means like this: the halacha allows an individual judge to judge a court case. We know you can have three people. You know, Dine Mamonot Bishlosha, but the halacha allows a Yachid Mumcha, one who's an expert, to judge alone. So the Mishnah is advising that's not such a good idea. That's not such a good idea to judge alone. The Bartanur explains that's only unless the litigants say they want you to judge alone. We discussed sometimes litigants want to hear just the opinion of one person, then that's okay. But normally you should not do that. Don't say accept my view. No rabbi should say, like Rav Moshe writes, you don't have to accept my view. Here's my view. If you like it, accept it. If you agree with me. If you don't agree with me, don't accept it. You have no right to say such a thing. We know there's the Gemara says, the Mishnah says that in a Sanhedrin, when you had the high court, so here you had the 71 or the 23, depending if it's a local high court or the Supreme Court. So you had 23 or 71 members in the court. So they're judging a case. So they have court deliberations, or you didn't have lawyers. The judge and lawyers were the same. In other words, the judges did the cross-examination for each side. They didn't represent side, but it was the role of the 23 judges to cross-examine the witnesses. So now they cross-examine, they hear all the evidence, and now they go into a deliberation. So they deliberate. So the halach is, they said, matchili min hatzad. We start on the side. So what does that mean? So the Sanhedrin used to sit in a semicircle, so everybody could see everybody, right? The law is that it's interesting law. It's not against, as far as I understood, I don't know, in modern times, whatever, a judge, you can't have a blind judge. Not that he's incapable, but we know facial expressions are very important. You have to see, because the judge is allowed to sort of, I don't want to say overrule the evidence. He can, there's something fishy about it. A judge is, that's why it's hard to be a judge. A judge doesn't have to always accept what two witnesses say. We know two witnesses are sort of the gold standard, but at times that's not really true. The judge is allowed, the Gemara in Shavuos talks about this, the judge can in a sense overrule. So the judge has to see, you can't, we understand why that's important. So so what was I saying? I forgot my train of thought. The judge, hold on.
Can't be blind.
Yeah, I know that. No, before, accepting your view. Okay, minat sad. I'm sorry. The Sanhedrin used to sit on the side. Thank you. I'm sorry. So on the side, so they used to sit in a semicircle so they could see each other. But the semicircle was set up in a position that the brightest, the most experienced and learned people were in the middle. And as you got further away from the middle, you had the rookie guy, who just graduated in the Smicha program. So he's the first person who speaks up. Matchili min hatzad, because we're afraid, if the senior rabbi speaks first, you're not going to want to argue with him. Oh. And the court wanted a free discussion. We should never be afraid. We should never be intimidated. Rav Moshe Feinstein's in the room, so I'm going to say something, my opinion. Crazy? No. So the halakha said, no, of course you should say your opinion. Rav Moshe speaks at the end. First, but we don't say accept my view. So that's the way to guarantee. That's the everybody, even great judges, people are intimidated by people who are more expert than they. So that's what the Mishnah says. Matchili min hatzad. Okay, then the Mishnah says, we'll introduce the next Mishnah. Rabbi Yonatan Omer, Kol Makayim Torah Me'oni, Sofo Makayim Me'osher. Whoever observes the Torah out of poverty will come to observe the Torah out of wealth. And whoever nullifies the Torah out of wisdom, out of wealth, will come to nullify the Torah from poverty. So we'll discuss this. What is this? A promise, reward, and punishment? I'll just say one idea here. Of course, really what the Mishnah is raising is the challenges of poverty and the challenges of wealth. That it's very hard. It's very hard to, there are all kinds of reasons now why not to observe the Torah. And some come from, I'm too poor, and some come from, I'm too wealthy. And what the commentaries point out, and I think we all know it's true. I think we who live in the wealthiest generation in Jewish history, even though those who are poor are relatively wealthy, mostly. I mean, of course, there are issues, but the challenges of wealth are usually much greater than the challenges of poverty. That and the challenges of wealth is twofold. One is he's too busy. He's too busy in business. You got to work 90 hours a week, 80 hours a week. It's a big problem we have today. Yeah, we've discussed it. It costs a lot of money to be a Jew, especially outside of Israel. Israel's expensive, but you don't have to pay for day school education. So A, you don't have time to be involved in Torah, and B, the greater fear, of course, is one of arrogance. That's people who become very wealthy often become extremely arrogant, and that can destroy their whole approach to Torah. We read last week that Moshe Rabbeinu, the one thing we know, that he was a humble person. So the Mishnah is discussing the problem of wealth and the problem of poverty. And then, but I will point out that generally speaking, all the yeshiva boys came from wealthy families in Europe. People who were poor couldn't afford. The whole kollel system was only built on wealth. So Torah can only survive if there's Torah. We discussed it, but the challenge of wealth is often much greater than the challenge of poverty. And the Gemara has they use the example of Hillel and Rabbi Eliezer ben Chisma. That Hillel was the poorest of the poor. He had to sleep on the roof because he couldn't afford the tuition. Beit Medrash. So Hillel is Machayev et ha'aniim. Hillel says all the poor people gets rid of their excuses. And Rabbi Eliezer says his father left him $50 million and 25 apartment buildings. The Gemara is a whole description we can go into. And yet he would sit and he would learn and resolve himself in Torah. In other words, there's always, it's to take away our excuses from learning. And then the Gemara concludes that Yosef Hatzadik is Mechayev et HaRisham. Yosef obligates all the wicked people. Said, you think you had you gave into your temptations. I had a woman, a beautiful woman, who every single day tried to go and seduce me. So you have to be able to be willing to put up to withstand the temptation. So it's interesting that sort of the three examples. Take somebody's very poor, somebody's very rich, and somebody got to face the temptations of lust and desire and yet overcame them. And these are the people who the Gemara says as to serve as the models for us, so we shouldn't have an excuse to not keep the Torah. Okay, anyways, I see it's late. I spent a little bit longer than I thought on the Rav Moshe and on Dean, but I think it's important. I hope it's important. I hope you found it beneficial. Yes. That the Rav Moshe's beautiful introduction, the problem of being a posek, truth in heaven and truth in earth and the reality of life. But there has to be a personal connection. The rabbi is obligated to personally answer questions. He's obligated to do the best he can, and even if he's wrong, it doesn't matter. It's okay, and you can get great reward for being wrong. It's the effort that counts much more than the result. That's a very Jewish thing. We say that when we make a siyum. Anu amelim v'heim amelim. We work hard and they work hard. We get the reward for the hard work. We don't get the reward for the results, because God is the one who determines our results, not us. So we can only put in our efforts. In the material world, of course, that's the bottom line that counts. That's how the material world works. But in the spiritual world, it's effort. So that's really what Rav Moshe said. You try your best. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're wrong. That's the rule. And you got to be fearless, and you got to rule what you think is right. But don't force anybody to accept your views. Don't force anybody to accept your views. Give reasoning. Let people pick and choose. And I think it's a beautiful approach. But you have to know when to ask, who to ask, and Seilach Harav, you have to be connected. Okay, just let me see. I see there, I think, a couple comments. However, for the divorce issue, non-Orthodox wedding, you have to clarify what that's referring to. I don't remember. Divorce issue, non-Orthodox weddings. I don't know what that's referring to. Sviglat, okay, buried in the Har Herzl. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, Morris, if you belong to a shul with the Rav, are you allowed to go to another Rav for a psak? So the answer I would say is yes, but in other words, you're not obligated to follow that the rabbi of your particular shul should be your Rav. At the same time, you're not allowed to do anything in the shul that goes against the psakim of the Rav. In other words, if you don't like what the Rav says, go daven in another shul. If quietly you want to, you want to go to Israel and keep 1 day yontif for 2 days yontif, and your rabbi says keep 2, and he's not really a person. Keep 1. I don't see any problem with that. I mean, you can't go shopping. You have to pick a rabbi, who you can't go shopping. But if that's your rabbi, he doesn't have to be your shul rabbi. But if there's a minhag in the shul, they do say tachanun or vayhi noam or all these little things that people make a big deal about it. You're not allowed to do anything that in the present. The Rav is the Rav of the shul, and all the balabatim have to follow his rulings in the shul. You don't like the rabbi's rulings, go daven somewhere else. You don't like it, be quiet and follow them. Otherwise, go somewhere else. So yes, you're not obligated. The question is, and I guess there are all kinds of reasons why you would want it up in the shul where you don't want the rabbis your rabbi, because people go to shul for all kinds of many different reasons. Kiddushes. That's why shuls are less crowded even when people go back. I don't know. They're having kiddushes in the States, from what I understand. Here, we're still stuck at 10 people. In the United States, they have kiddush after davening. That's what I understand. No, what can you do? Okay, last of us, Ikwich said, junior members sit on the outside, correct? That's what we said. More senior, closer to the middle. Yeah, okay. Right, okay. Thank you very much. Any other comments? Anybody feel free to speak up. Otherwise, I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. Mr. Zucker, we'll get to you. It's always nice to hear your questions. Good. And I want to wish everybody Shabbat Shalom. All the best. Sunday morning, Sefer Dvarim with Rabbi Liebtag. And then Monday, we finished our Rishvat series. Monday night, March 4th. I mentioned yesterday, for those who are at the Parsha Shir, on Tuesday, we're having a special interview conversation, whatever you want to call it. My brother, actually, Rabbi Mori Kelman, is going to be interviewing Shira Mervis, who is the woman who was just appointed as the spiritual leader of the Beit Knesset in Efrat. It was written up in the paper, sort of the first woman sort of as the leader. So we'll be at 1 p.m. on Tuesday. We'll be in conversation with her, and so you have to register for that. And we look forward to learning with you. And everybody have a wonderful Shabbos and be well. And yes, Mr. Zucker, what would you like to know?
You spoke about you mustn't be afraid to disagree with the Gadol Hador, perhaps if we are up to it. If we're talking about so right. It's stronger than that. We're allowed to disagree with the voice from heaven, the Tanur Shalachim. Right,
correct. Right. I would say we're more allowed to disagree with the voice from heaven than from the great rabbis. In other words, there is or with a ruling of a court. Yeah, of course, you're always allowed to. I mean, listen, you have to put it in perspective. If I say something and Rav Moshe, I say, I remember Rav Schachter told us once, like, yeah, you can think what you feel. If you do it, do what you think. And then if you look and say every other rabbi in history disagrees with you, so then you better think. Now, it doesn't mean you're wrong. It doesn't mean you're wrong, but you want to think twice, why think very hard. But yes, so you have to know yourself. So most people don't know enough. It depends why I'll read a tshuva in Rav Moshe. So who am I to disagree with Moshe? What am I, an idiot? On the other hand, sometimes I will say, you know what? I'm not disagreeing with the Moshe's halakhic reasoning. I'm disagreeing with his sociological analysis. Rav Moshe, right, he's against bar mitzvahs. They sort of, right? The famous, they asked Rav Moshe about a bat mitzvahs. So Rav Moshe says, bat mitzvahs, if it was up to me, I'd get rid of the bar mitzvah. The old joke, there's a lot of bar and not mitzvah. The people after the bar mitzvah, that's the end of their Jewish education. So he wrote a whole really attack on the American. Remember, he's writing in the 50s or 60s, the old son. So you know what? I think that's wrong. Why do I think it's wrong? I think that bar mitzvah, maybe the kid went to Hebrew school for 5 years because the shul wanted to allow him to have a bar mitzvah if he didn't go to Hebrew school. Actually, kept many Jews, in the fold, and maybe helped the Jew, whatever. In other words, I think, I can say that there's a different read on what, I don't know that Ramosha, had a greater understanding of American, I don't want to chas v'shalom, down, but I think there is room, even for idiots like me, to disagree with certain aspects, or to question, or to, I don't want to say disagree, I would rule differently. Now, obviously, if it becomes a complex halachic issue, that's ridiculous. Obviously, if Ramosha says, okay, he knows what he's talking about. For the truth matter, I shouldn't even use Ramosha. We're not supposed to go to people who are not alive. We use that as now only a reference point. Ramosha is now a reference point. A shofet asher yeh bayamim ha'em. You go to the judge who's alive at that time. Yeah. And because the halacha is in that time, that's what our whole last two classes have been about. So you can't go to a dead posek. The person who's not alive, you can read it for information to inform how I'm going to rule now. But really, that's why there was, some people didn't want to write down things. That's why the Rabbi said we have an oral law. We're not supposed to write down the oral law. Because as Ramosha said, once it's written down, people take it really seriously. And we don't want that. We want every generation, the rabbis, to issue rulings free from the writings of previous generation. That's how the Rabbi, that's the Chatam Sofer's great grandson, in the introduction to Kulin, his beautiful introduction, I've mentioned it, I think, once or twice, on the history of the Torah Shabbat Peh, explains why the Torah is meant to be oral. Unfortunately, with exile and destruction, it couldn't work. We had no choice. But then he writes, as we come back to the land of Israel now, he was a big Zionist, even though he was a Hungarian rabbi. And he moved to Israel in 1921. So he felt that now we're going to slowly go back to this old system where we're not going to be so beholden to previous rabbis. We're going to, do on our own. So you can disagree with Ramosha, but you have to do that very carefully. You have to know you have to know your level. When Ramosha says, who am I? That's also who am I? There's somebody who am I is sort of, okay. And there's somebody where it's really true. When somebody says I'm a nobody, for some people that's not true. For some people, they really are nobodies. So you have to know when you're a nobody, and therefore, you're just like if you have a grade 11 course in physics, you wouldn't argue with Einstein. You may question Einstein, but you're not going to argue with him. So I don't know if that answers the question. Okay. Anybody else that want to other questions? I'm happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. All the best, everybody. Yes. Shabbat Shalom.